Hey y'all, welcome to Abnormal Psych. So pretty much like chapter one of any old class, we're going to be starting off today pretty simply. We're basically going to be defining what abnormal psych is. So this is a pretty straightforward chapter. So our definition of what makes something abnormal versus not is basically a three-part definition. So the first thing that we need to focus in on if we are kind of determining, is this behavior, this person in front of me abnormal or no, is we need to look at statistics. So pretty much all behaviors, traits are normally distributed, meaning that if we were to measure the intelligence, for instance, of all people, it would fall along a normally distributed bell curve, meaning that most people fall towards the middle or are average, with a relative few being significantly below average or significantly above average. Statistically, the bell curve on the screen here is going to be showing you proportionally how many people we could expect to be at different parts around the bell curve. And from a clinical perspective, we consider something to be significantly deviated from the mean if it is 2 standard deviations or more away from the mean, meaning that we're focusing in on about 5% of the population. So you guys can see here that about 70% of people fall within 1 standard deviation of the mean, and about 95% of people fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So clinically, stuff that's going to be of more focus to us is stuff that's more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean, meaning that, again, we're kind of focusing in on about 5% of the population. And it's not a coincidence that you guys will see over the course of the semester that about the average prevalence of many of the disorders we're going to be talking about is about 5%. There's certainly going to be some that are rarer, things that impact less than 1% of people, like anorexia, for instance, or things that impact 10% or 15% of people, things like social anxiety. But in general, that 5% to standard deviation away from the mean rule is a good one to kind of fall back on. But does that mean that just because we look at a graph and a person is 2 or more standard deviations away from the mean with respect to whatever trait or behavior or score it is we're focusing on, that we just automatically say that they're abnormal at that point? No, of course, it's going to be more complicated than that. The second part of this definition is that we need to consider context. What is the context of this behavior? Because some behaviors may be abnormal or atypical in certain contexts, but not necessarily in others. So it's important to kind of pay attention to where the behavior is happening. And there's several different pieces of context. One is time. So we'll sometimes refer to this as temporal context. What is the time that this behavior is occurring in? So an example I always give of this is, music. Like if you were to go back to the 1900s or even mid-century and you were to look at a popular musical act, that act would look very different than, I know the Lady Gaga meat dress is a bit of a dated reference at this point, but I legitimately can't really come up with an image that is more like wow than that. So that's just an example of how time has kind of changed what we would consider to be normal or typical or really kind of surprising or not. Like you would literally need someone to be wearing something more wild and outlandish than a dress made of meat in order to really kind of shock a person today, when it would take much less to shock a person from an entertainment point of view when, the Beatles were really popular. Physical context is also important. So here on the screen, you guys can see that I've got, one graphic of some boys throwing paper airplanes in a classroom. And then I've got some other images of kids throwing paper airplanes and other objects outside during recess or at a park. So the behavior here is the same. We've got little kids who are throwing things. But in one instance, the behavior would be considered abnormal. The kids would be written up, maybe sent to detention. Parents would be called if we were throwing things in the classroom. But outside, that same behavior would be considered a healthy thing, might even result in a teacher or a parent suggesting that that child join like a basketball team or something like that. So behaviors are the same, but physical context is going to determine how we appraise that particular behavior. Other pieces of context group expectations. So who is the group that is evaluating the behavior? Because who that group is will sometimes determine what that evaluation is. So for instance, if you had a teenager who was experimenting with alcohol and weed or vaping, for instance, and all of their friends were doing that, that would be a very normal behavior within that group. But parents evaluating that behavior might evaluate that behavior very differently. Similarly, seeing ghosts or talking about possession or things like that, here in the United States, that's not really a culturally condoned behavior, but in parts of Latin America, for instance, where contact with spirits is something that is more encouraged and contextually accepted, you know, that same behavior wouldn't really be evaluated in the same way. And that brings us into cultural patterns. That kind of possession piece is a good example of a cultural pattern. Another example I do, or another demonstration, I guess, of how a cultural pattern can impact what we consider to be abnormal or not, is I typically talk about body alteration or body mutilation, ways in which we kind of take our body in its natural form and we change the way that it looks, and how different forms of alteration are kind of judged differently based on, I mean, what they are, who's doing it, where we're doing it. So again, if you guys are kind of watching this versus listening to it, you'll see several pictures on the screen. One is of self-harm, so a person who's been cutting or scratching at themselves. We also have an image of piercings, another one of tattoos, another one of a more kind of, I guess, less mainstreamed form of body modification. We've got someone who's split their tongue, and then we have scarification finally. So all of these would fall under the general umbrella of bodily alteration, but at the end of the day, whether or not we can consider one to be abnormal versus not has a lot to do with the context and the culture. So self-harm, we've got a person who is changing their body, who's harming themselves intentionally, but because of the emotional context of that behavior, typically we've got someone who is in pain, who is depressed, who's trying to express themselves and can't find another way to do so other than this. We wouldn't really consider that to be normal, not really in this country, or I would say in any other country. But then on the far side of the screen, you've got someone who is similarly injuring themselves. The process of scarification is something that we see more so in other countries, but it basically takes the form of intentionally harming oneself so that this scar pattern creates an aesthetically pleasing image, kind of like with tattooing, but rather than injecting ink, we're kind of playing around with scar tissue instead. But because there's not that emotional background to scarification, we don't really consider that one to be abnormal. That being said, still, if you saw someone walking down King Street with this very intense scarification going on, despite the fact that that doesn't have that negative emotional background to it, it still would cause more surprise or turn more heads than someone who has tattoos, just because from a cultural point of view, that just isn't a form of bodily modification we see quite as much in this country. Things like tattoos and piercings have become much more popular in recent years, so those aren't even necessarily that head turning anymore. That being said, it still kind of depends on the extent to which we're seeing piercings and tattoos. You know, there's a difference between a nose ring and an ear gauge, for instance, or there's a difference between a bicep piece and a face tattoo. There's a difference between just kind of bearing tattoos or piercings, just kind of being out and about versus in certain jobs. Those forms of bodily modification are looked at differently. And then we've got even kind of more intense, I guess, forms of bodily modification, like splitting one's tongue or changing the color of one's eyes or having one's belly button removed. There are so many, you know, so as piercings and tattoos become more common and more normal, quote unquote, we kind of see that boundary being pushed more. So kind of similar to the music example that I gave earlier. So basically, it's important to focus in on the culture. You know, what are people doing within this particular culture? Is this behavior normal or not? Is there an emotional piece behind this behavior or not that would maybe be cause for concern? Developmental age and maturity also play a role as well. So some behaviors are more acceptable at certain ages or maturity levels than others. So sometimes we have to attend to the natural developmental trajectory of a diagnosis. Developmental trajectory is a really fancy term that basically means that sometimes different disorders look different for people at different ages. So depression isn't just depression across the board. For instance, younger people tend to express depression via hostility and irritability, versus older people, when they're depressed, they tend to get more sad, anhedonic, lose interest in things. So to see a young person who is hostile as a form of depression is normal. To see an older person who's hostile but depressed, that's more abnormal. So it's important to kind of attend to age. Another example is bedwetting. Bedwetting is something that you see from little kids as they're learning to potty train. But if a child is regularly bedwetting after the age of 5, suddenly we've got a diagnosis for that now. It's called enuresis. But 5 is kind of that age kind of cutoff point. So you can have a kid who is engaged in a behavior and it's fine, it's developmentally appropriate, and then we have a birthday and suddenly it's a little bit more cause for concern. So age plays a role in context as well. And then finally we have dysfunction, and this is something I kind of hit on a little bit in the body alteration cutting kind of scenario, that the emotional piece and the dysfunction was really what kind of made cutting more abnormal than something like scarification. And again, that's kind of highlighted here in these two cases. So consider for yourself the differences here. So case number 1 is a guy named Robert. He's a cautious person who spends 5 to 10 minutes per day checking to make sure his doors are locked and appliances are turned off before going to bed or taking a nap. Stan, on the other hand, is also a cautious person who often worries that he has left his door unlocked and that he will be robbed when away from home. While at home, Stan spends 2 hours checking and rechecking the security of his home, which has begun to negatively impact him socially and at work. So at the end of the day, we've got 2 people on the OCD spectrum, but one is significantly more impaired than the other. And I find that important to point out. So frequently I have students who just like will ask me at the end of a class, like, oh, like I do this, you know, I'm really kind of OCD about my desk. Is that bad? Does that mean I have OCD? And the question I always kind of follow that up with, like, well, is it a problem for you? Does it upset you that you do that? You know, is it impairing? Like, is it tough for you to get work done? Is it tough for you to have relationships because of that? Do you wish you were different? And at the end of the day, if there's no dysfunction, no distress, no impairment, then I don't really consider the problem to be like therapy worthwhile. Like, it's not, you know, if it's not a problem, then like don't fix it. So one thing that you guys are going to want to work on in this class, a problem that I've seen with students before, is the tendency to look at a case and recognize some element of it as diagnostic. Like in this case, you can look at number 1 and think OCD to yourself, but I want you to get away from just thinking OCD and like assuming it's OCD and assuming it's a problem, to really taking a step back and evaluating, like, is this really a problem for this person? Like, yeah, most people probably aren't spending 10 minutes a day, which is really a lot of time if you really were to time it. But most people aren't really spending 10 minutes a day looking at the security of their home. But like, is 10 minutes really enough that it's impairing this guy? Like, you know, if he's feeling impaired, then that's one thing, but if he's not, then he's not. And so we really want to get away from just kind of labeling things just because they look familiar. We really want to take that extra step back and look at dysfunction. So what does it mean for something to be abnormal? It means that we're dealing with a behavior or thought or feeling that is statistically deviant. So it's impacting about 5% of the population. It's deviant within its given context. So like scarification would be more statistically deviant in this country than in Africa, for instance, but also is causing distress and impairment. So even though scarification is statistically deviant in this country, we wouldn't consider it to be problematic or diagnostic because it's not really causing this person distress or impairment in any way. This person is expressing who they are and it's not getting in the way of them living their lives. So deviance within a context causing some type of distress, impairment, or dysfunction. Okay, so now let's switch gears a little bit because typically when I kind of ask students, like, what do you think makes something abnormal? Answers that frequently come up will be relating to danger, you know, are we hurting people or harming people, or sometimes eccentricity will come into play as well. So now that we've kind of established what it is to be abnormal, I do want to take a minute and talk about these 2 pieces because again, they are kind of popular answers. So what does it mean to be eccentric? Eccentric means that a person is violating a social norm. So they're doing something unexpected. So yes, this is deviant within a sociocultural context. So we are still kind of ticking off those first two pieces. But it's usually not harmful. There's usually not that third piece. We're not really seeing the dysfunctional element. However, a behavior can become abnormal if it starts off as eccentric and then starts to involve that danger piece, because now we are dealing with distress or impairment. If not for the individual, then there's definitely distress or impairment caused to another. So the example I always give of this is James Egan Holmes. He was a quirky graduate student. He included pictures of llamas on his grad app, admissions material, which is strange. You guys haven't applied to grad school yet, but I mean, that would be weird to kind of have that slide across your desk as an admissions counselor. But that in and of itself would just be eccentric. It would just simply be deviant and unexpected within the context, not enough to consider it to be abnormal using our parameters. But James Egan Holmes eventually became the Aurora, Colorado Batman movie theater shooter. So now we are kind of incorporating danger into this equation. And so now collectively, yes, this picture is reading as abnormal. So at that point, you might be wondering to yourself, well, then is danger then this magic piece that suddenly makes everything abnormal? Not really. Sometimes, yes, danger can be abnormal, but sometimes no. I find it more helpful to look at the pattern, like, is this person regularly dangerous, or is this just a one-time thing? It's also important to kind of think back again to those three criteria we talked about earlier. So the example I always give is a post-class parking lot snafu. So let's say we're, attending classes in person, we're all kind of out and about more, and we have a student who goes to a class and, maybe they got back a bad test grade or something like that. They're just not in a great mood, they're frustrated, they're pissed off, they're going out to their car. They hop in their car, just kind of turn on the engine, pop it in reverse, and just kind of back up really aggressively without looking. Fortunately, they don't hit anybody, but they ram their car back into like a parking pylon or part of the infrastructure of the parking deck. That's definitely dangerous behavior. Damage was caused, people could have been hurt, but it's not a pattern. That was a one-time thing for this person. And beyond that, from a statistical point of view, feeling frustrated or being acutely chaotic in one's car when angry isn't necessarily a strange behavior. It's something that people do sometimes in our culture. That being said, if it's a regular pattern, that would definitely be abnormal. But if this was a one-time thing, no one was really hurt, I wouldn't really consider that person or that scenario necessarily to be abnormal, given kind of our definition based on that one event alone. So at the end of the day, danger does not equate to abnormality either. Eccentricity and danger separately or together, they're sometimes part of the picture, but we ultimately need more information. And again, I'd refer you guys back to the three criteria we previously established in terms of trying to determine whether something's abnormal or not. Another thing that I'll point out is that most people with a psychological diagnosis are not dangerous. That is a huge misconception that exists out there, one that we'll talk about more this semester when we talk about sensitive language and schizophrenia. But people with psychological diagnoses are more likely to be the victims of crime than to commit crimes themselves. Okay, so this is the last little piece that I have for you guys, and this is going to be one of the things I want you to be reflecting about this week in preparation for our next discussion. So I've got 4 cases for you here. The last one has 2 parts to it, but I want you to think about whether or not each of these individuals is normal or abnormal, and I want you to be prepared to defend your decision. More specifically, use the 3 criteria. So in making your decision, think back: statistical deviance within a context, dysfunction, and use those 3 pieces as your discussion points in making one decision versus another. So we'll use this to start our next class. All right, I will see you later.